Welcome to another episode of the Svarim Chatter Podcast. I'm Nachi Weinstein. This bonus episode of the podcast is being posted for Rabbi Forshlager's yahrzeit, who is the subject matter of this episode, which is this Shabbos, Parshas Vayera, Tesvav Cheshvan. This episode of the podcast is dedicated in honor of Hong Kong's Oalea Synagogue and Rabbi Kreizel, a descendant of Rabbi Forshlager, who brings light and Torah to the community. To sponsor an episode of the podcast, you can email me, svarimchatter@gmail.com, or check out the links and information in the show's notes below. There's also a link to subscribe to the Svarim Chatter WhatsApp community, where I post new Svarim and new books, book deals, and so on. You can also, if you can, please subscribe and rate the podcast, whether you listen on 24/6, Apple, Spotify. And with that, enjoy the episode. Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of the Svarim Chatter Podcast. On this episode of the podcast, I'm going to be joined by Pinny Kreizel, and we will be discussing Michoel Forshlager, known as the Torah Michoel, and there's been a biography also published, Michoel Ba'achas. Recently, a new edition of that biography came out. There's also an English edition of the biography. The Hebrew one is expanded edition. We'll discuss that. And there's been some Svarim, Torah Michoel al Torah, Torah Michoel al Shas. A new sefer is going to be published now, Kedushas Michoel. It's also Rabbi Forshlager's yahrzeit. It's coming up, Tesvav Cheshvan, November 16th this year. So, for that, I thought it would be a good idea to talk about Rabbi Forshlager on the podcast. I know there's kind of been like this renaissance in discussing Rabbi Forshlager. So I'm sure, listeners know about him, and those that don't, who was he, and, why are people find him interesting? So thank you, Pinny, for joining me.
Thank you, Nachi, for having me.
So let's sort of tell the listeners a little bit about yourself and your background.
Sure. My name is Pinny Kreizel. I was born in Monsey. My mother is a great-granddaughter of Rabbi Michoel Forshlager. She was born in Baltimore and eventually ended up in New York, in Monsey. I grew up, in a Hasidic community. I went to Israel. I came back, kind of did different things. I eventually ended up as a teacher in Hong Kong, which is an interesting story. So that's kind of just a background about myself, sort of in brief. My connection to...
Before that, I want to say that although the podcast isn't about you, but what's interesting, and I guess is, different, but it's somewhat of a parallel. You ended up in Hong Kong, which is kind of, not the typical. And Michoel Forshlager ended up in Baltimore, in America, in the, so a long time ago when it wasn't kind of your typical either at the time. And we'll talk about how he ended up there. So yeah, you were starting to say, what's your connection? I mean, you said you're an Anikel, but that's just your connection? What's your connection to Michoel Forshlager?
Sure. So when I was growing up, it was in the years where Forshlager was mostly unknown, which was basically up until probably 15 years ago. And so we had the sefer, which is a Lamdisha sefer on Shas. We had it at home. My father, who was not a direct descendant, it was my mother, he would tell me, you should know, you have a big Zayda, you should, understand. I tried once to open the sefer. Really, even today, I struggle a little bit. You have to understand, the sugis in order to appreciate it. And then about 10 years ago, a man named Rabbi Bergman from Brooklyn reached out to me. He became the person working on Rabbi Forshlager's Svarim, which is its own story. And so once I got to talk to him, all of a sudden there was a lot more information about who he was and understanding the greatness of his character, the extent of his Torah, and also realizing that this is a huge mitzvah, meaning there's so much out there and so little actually published, so little being worked on. We find a parallel with other great Gedolim who have a lot of manuscripts who were not as well published, and Anikel ends up deciding to be involved. It's basically my story. Is there's so much there and not a lot being done, and I'm doing my part to enhance and establish his legacy.
Okay, and listen, he was somebody that during his life he wasn't well known. He ended up in Baltimore in the United States. He wasn't so well known, and subsequent decades he wasn't either. And now this like you and others have been doing their part to publish his writings and a biography and get the word out there. Okay, so let's talk about Michoel Forshlager. He's born in Europe, late 19th century. When was he born? Where was he born? What can you tell listeners about his basic biography, his parents, and who he learned by, Avnei Nezer? We'll get there, but what can you say about especially his youth?
Okay, so Rabbi Forshlager was born in 1883 in a small town called Lovitch, which is near Sakhachev. His parents were Sakhachev Hasidim, not anything great in terms of they weren't great rabbis or just good Jews. And from a young age, he he sort of stood out as being very connected to Torah. He was studying. He said he made a siyum on Mishnah's Kalim when he was 6. Like kind of these like sort of big accomplishments from a young age. Interesting tidbit. He couldn't see for the first 2 years of his life. And then one day he was walking with his grandmother and he said, Baba ichzeh, I can see. And so when he was basically around 6, he wanted to go to, he had this desire to go to Sakhachev. So he actually made the trek by foot on a Shushan Purim, which is about a 4-hour walk, maybe 16 kilometers, I don't know, something like that. And he made the trek on foot, and something caught him really from when he first stepped into Sakhachev. Something really struck his attention. Sakhachev at the time, just to give some context, so in general, most Hasidic courts were not known for their greatness in Nigla, in Gemara, in Psak. They were known more for like their Hasidus and their Shemayim. Sakhachev was different. Sakhachev was part of the Polish Hasidus, which is Kotsk and Ger, and they were very much Nigla. That was the approach. Gemara and Rishonim and Psak, and Avnei Nezer was known as one of the great poskim in Poland. And actually, his name Avnei Nezer is not in the Sefer he wrote, but it's on the Tshuvas that were published. The Sefer he wrote was Egletal, and he's known as the Avnei Nezer. So people would send from all around Poland. They would send shilas to him, and so Rabbi Forshlager became connected. So he joined. He went back. So he was still young. So he went back home. After he had come, and he had a Rebbe and different people, and eventually when he was, I forgot exactly what age, when he was pretty young, he joined the yeshiva. He was allowed to join, and it was said that he was so short that they had to put books on the chair just so he can sit with the shir. So he just fully immersed himself. He became kind of a very close talmid to the Avnei Nezer. In fact, for the last 12 years of the Avnei Nezer's life, he didn't learn one-on-one with talmidim. He was already older, but he did learn with the Rabbi Forshlager for hours each day. And so really, it's safe to say he was a talmid muvak, and a lot of Nezer's Torah kind of was passed down. His derech was passed down to Rabbi Forshlager. Now, yeah. So later.
Sorry, I was only going to jump in and say that Avnei Nezer, what you said is that, like you said, everyone knows the Avnei Nezer from his Tshuvas, from Eglei Tal, from his Sefer on Halacha, and so he's really known with Tshuva and Lamdas and Halacha. I mean, that's what he's known by, more than, Chassidish Torah, which is interesting and unique.
Yeah. His son, the Shem Shmuel, was known, more for Chassidus and that, but he was also a huge gun in his own right. And actually, in the Eglei Tal is two parts. There's the middle part, which is a shortened version of what he says, and the outside. And the middle was written by Shem Shmuel, kind of to give people a shorter summary, of what the Avnei Nezer himself wrote. So in Akdam of Eglei Tal, he talks a little bit about this idea of derech limit of really understanding very deeply the sugya and the rishonim, and that was Rabbi Forshlager took that method very far. And they said when Rabbi Forshlager did the dashik, Rajba falls out. Like when he spins his hat, he was the expert in that, and he would sit behind the stove, very thin, quiet, reserved person, and people would come visit Avnei Nezer, would come and actually consult with him and go behind the stove and talk to him, and that way he met a lot of the great Gedolim. Also, the older generation of the Avnei Nezer's students. So you had the Kozhikov, who was more of a contemporary. You have the Chalkasiyov. You had these different big figures, and he was connected to them. So really, I think we set up that he came from the elite of Polish Lamdas and Europe, in a way European Torah study, and so it makes his story and his move to America even more intriguing, because we know a lot of the great Torah figures of Europe, and we know who they are, and we know the ones who came to America are pretty well known, and so to find someone of this stature who was relatively unknown in his lifetime is pretty unique.
So what made Michoel and his family, and what made him go to America? Why did he decide to leave Europe? This was not something that was commonly done at the time.
Yeah, and even more so, that was 1920, so it was way before the Holocaust. It was really leaving Poland at that time was spiritual suicide for anybody, but especially for someone as great as him. Like, there's nothing in America for his level, even not his level. So really, he lost a few kids in the First World War with typhus. Sakharov was destroyed, and he moved, and his family was really urging him to leave. They were very poor, and his father had left prior. His father had already established himself in the U.S. in Baltimore, and so they really pushed him to come, and he really didn't want to. His wife he was very, very hesitant to leave. And he spoke about that. That he didn't really want to go, but he had no choice. His family kind of pushed him. So he ended up in America. He ended up in Baltimore, which is where his father came from. And really, as soon as he arrived in America, he realized that it's a desert. It's a desert, and I can relate, with Hong Kong. Like, you sort of feel like you come out of a place like New York, and where there's shuls everywhere and there's yeshivas, and come to a place where there's very little. And again, there's Baruch Hashem a very thriving Jewish community here, but obviously it's not Israel or New York. And so you kind of get some context of how that must have felt. And so he established himself in Baltimore. That's where he came. He really wasn't interested at all in assimilating and changing his ways. He kept himself connected to Poland, to Europe 100%, but that's where he lived.
So what did he do in Baltimore? I mean, they probably would. First of all, also he said he kept himself connected. I mean, he stayed always connected to Sakharov, to Hasidus. He was kind of a Hasid. There was no real Hasidim in Baltimore at the time. So what did he do? And do we know what he did?
Right. So what's known from people who have met with him is that anytime he would mention the word Sakharov, his eyes would start tearing up, and he would stand up sometimes when he mentioned his. So he stayed very, in terms of the idea of like a chassid to a rebbe or a talmid to his rebbe. He stayed connected, davok, kisher neshmasei, like his essence of his soul, his whole life. So that was very, very strong. In terms of external expression, Ritaka wasn't. There wasn't really much chassidus at all. I mean, the fact that he had a beard was really huge chiddush. People ask actually, like was he chassidish? Like, when there's no external expression, like it's hard to give that statement meaning. But internally he was, and there were certain things, and actually we'll talk later about the new sefer. But his derech avodas Hashem, not limit, but in derech avodas Hashem was very, very much like Polish Hasidus, like where it's like kedusha and devekus and Hashem and all of that, and Torah not to become smart, just Torah for because you're learning Hashem's word. There was very much of that, and interesting because he would encourage the Ner Yisrael students to go to the mikveh every day, and he would at one point he even pay them $1 for anybody who would go to the mikveh, which is a very Hasidish thing. So he had that. There was something there. It didn't necessarily express itself the way you would think of Hasidish, the shtreimel, but it was certainly there.
Yeah, you see the pictures. You see these no Strimel, Bekesha. He wasn't. You said he had a beard.
Yeah.
A small beard. He had a beard, so he did have.
Yeah.
But again, he wasn't Baltimore, the United States at the time. So, what did he do in Baltimore? How did he sustain? What kind of job?
So when he first came, when he first moved, So very good. Yeah, good question. So when he first arrived, he wasn't looking for a career. So he would do like schlepping things. Like he would do very menial labor, things that didn't require him to leave. The world of Torah just to support himself. And at some point, the Balabatim in Baltimore realized that this is not some typical European person. It's someone very chashuv, had a beard, and so they ended up asking him to give shiurim. And I mean, we know the stories that even in the early days in America, there was still this feeling of people have a shir, a mishnayos shir, a gemara shir, even if they weren't necessarily connected or was even religious. So that's what he would do for the rest of his life. The way he supported himself was through giving shiurim, and he wasn't rich from that. It was really he didn't need much. His level of sacrifice for Torah was very high. I don't know if even himself realized that he's missing, because I think his priorities were elsewhere. But certainly his family suffered. I know I've spoken to my great uncles or my uncle or descendants, and what they talked about was this feeling of they didn't get what they should have maybe gotten, and maybe they felt a resentment towards him. He wasn't like all the other parents who worked and the American dream, but he his legacy is much larger than that. Much larger than what he's able to provide in his own lifetime. So yes, he supported himself. Giving shiurim. He would give shiurim in the morning, and he did it in the evening. He had like a few shuls. So one is not Ner Yisrael. One is so it's called the German shul, like the Deutsche shul. It's very well known, very established. Like they had a lot of very wealthy people, and so that was one called Chizik Emunah. We'll talk about that. It becomes important later. And then the other one was the Russisch shul, was Bnei Israel, which actually is still around today. In Baltimore, very interesting. They're in downtown Baltimore, which were all the people when they came from the port. So they moved to downtown Baltimore, and a lot of them stayed there for a long time, like Lower East Side. But eventually they moved. They moved to more, suburbs. We see that in New York, where people moved out, out of the Lower East Side into other places. And so he established himself in those two places. And Bnei Israel is actually active today still. They run the cemetery where he's buried. There's still shul. They still have services. I don't know if they have every single day, but they have certainly on Shabbos and special occasions. And they're involved. And they're actually they've been very influential in helping us with the cemetery and helping us try to work to establish it better. And so we give a big gratitude to them. And it's Orthodox, and it's it's still there. So that's basically his
Yeah, but now as we get to his daily schedule, as you said, he supported himself through teaching small teaching positions here and there. But what was his daily schedule like?
Yeah, basically he learned for the most of the day. I think he slept maybe 3 hours, and he would say that later in his life they forced him. The doctor said he had to sleep another hour, because they told him 8 hours. He's like, I'm not going to sleep 8 hours, but another hour. So he said, I'm sleeping like a bear, 4 hours a night. Like he was, so he spent his entire life, entire day and night, just in his 4 amas of halacha, like in his library, in his house, just learning nonstop, and really not even writing, because writing came towards later on when he no longer had the koiches, like the strength to do his normal like learning styles. Learning work. So he switched. He did an easier work, which was writing Kedusha Torah. So very much his whole life was Torah, and then he had the shiurim, and he had some chavrusas with some balabatim, wanted some more, but really that was it. It was Torah.
Now, he did have an impact or an involvement with Ner Yisrael in Baltimore. Can you speak more to that?
Yeah. So in really, because he understood that America is not what it was, whenever he would find anybody like a bacher or someone who had like a spark, he would really encourage them, try to cultivate it, try to get them to go to yeshiva. So he actually told Rav Gifter, who was born in Baltimore, he told him this year, when he went to Europe to study in Slovak, he said, this year you're learning in European yeshiva in Europe. Next year you're learning in a European yeshiva in America. So he had this kind of goal of establishing a European style yeshiva in America. When Rav Ruderman came to Baltimore to collect money for his father-in-law's Kreizel, he met with Rabbi Forshlager. Rabbi Forshlager really encouraged him or asked him to stay in Baltimore to establish a yeshiva. And he said it depends if he has support. And so Rabbi Forshlager worked through his connections with the wealthy balabatim. He worked to get him a position as a rav, and to get to get support to start this yeshiva. And so really Rav Ruderman came as a result of Rav Forshlager, as far as we have the record of. And he did a lot, behind the scenes, like during the wartime when there was, rations, he would arrange. One day showed up to yeshiva with a big bag of sugar, which sugar was a huge, rare commodity, which in the wartime, and big bag, he found it through his connections. He was a very, he was a humble person, but he had a lot of connections, and he used them for those purposes. And actually, he used them for supporting Torah as well. So Rav Kahneman would come to Baltimore, and he would give him a yearly donation of $5,000, which huge amount of money back then. But he would have, Balabatim would give him money, and he would basically funnel all the money towards buying Sfarim and towards supporting Torah study and all that. So yeah, he was involved in that.
Buying Sfarim is something that, being a Sfarim collector, a Sfarim Chatter podcast, I'm sure, we have many Sfarim fans here on the podcast, and this is something that he was the Sfarim collector. I find so fascinating about him. He was they say he was the number one customer of Biegel Eisen Sfarim store, and he never met them, right? If I remember correctly, he never met Biegel Eisen, never went to the store. He would order all the time, just countless Sfarim. Do they still have any of the receipts, by the way?
They have letters. They've kept it. I went there. I've talked to them, and they know like Forshlager. They know of him, like from even before this farm came out. They knew of him. Again, it's kind of that thing where we talk about the letters where he was unknown to the majority of people, but to the circles of farm collectors and farm sellers and talmid chacham, he was known. Like he was a known person. So basically, the way it would work is they would send him sfarm. So back then, a lot of the second generation of people the European immigrants who brought their sfarm with them, the next generation didn't appreciate. They would keep a siddur, a chumash, maybe even a gemara, but they didn't appreciate all the other things. So they would sell it, estate sales. They would sell the whole batch, and Biegel Eisen was a big collector in sfarm. So they would buy all these sfarm, and they had an arrangement. They would any new sefer that came out that they thought was of interest, or they would send it to Rabbi Forshlager, and they would and he would send them money. It was like a blind arrangement. And if he didn't need something, he would send it back. He would send back the sefer. So he and through that way, over the years, he amassed a huge collection, but not just big, but also very rare. A lot of the sfarim, he understood, because of his background, he understood the value of each sefer, understood, where it fits into the general sfarim library of a talmid chacham, and so he collected, a huge collection, probably 7,000 sfarim, and a lot of rare. And people, there was a story, I forgot the name of the set at the moment. It was a very rare set, something maybe from the brothers, like the Hasidic printer Slavita. I think I'm not sure at the moment, but someone wanted to pay a lot of money to sell it. And he's like, sell a sefer? Like, horrified at the idea of selling a sefer. And I think sfarim collectors can appreciate that feeling of like, it becomes part of you. And so I spoke to my, his grandson who lives in Baltimore, and he said that the sfarim, like they kept the sfarim after Rabbi Forshlager's passing until his wife passed, until Rabbi Forshlager passed. And the reason was because she was so used to that was like the furnishing in the house was piles of sfarim from floor to ceiling, like that he she couldn't let it go. And then eventually when she passed, they found a place. He knew all of them by heart. He knew the sfarim by heart. He knew exactly where they were. In the dark, he'd be able to pick one out. He would tell people, can you go to that shelf and pick something? And when they moved, he like worked with somebody like one of his talmidim, like to detail exactly how many sfarim on each shelf and to pack them exactly as this. Even though he was a very humble person and he wouldn't talk about himself at all, there's a story where when there's a shul Rugas in Baltimore, and when he came first time to Baltimore, he was a young Hasidic Rav, and he came to see, he heard there's a Hasidic Rav in Baltimore, and so he came in and he wanted to impress on him. His name is Rav Taub, sorry, I just remembered his name. He wanted to impress on him, maybe that it's possible to achieve greatness even in America. So he told him to pick any sefer and open it up and start saying the words. And he continued wherever he opened any sefer, no matter what, he opened it. And Taka, when he wrote his ksavim, his manuscripts, he wrote everything by heart. He didn't rely on any like Marmar Klemis. He just wrote everything by heart. And when you see this farm and you see the amount of Marmar Klemis and rare obscure farm, you realize like what a great achievement that is.
Do you own any of his farm? His personal
No,
farm?
I wish. So all of this farm have been, and we can talk about that more, but all this farm were sold to Yad Rav Herzog, the publisher of the Encyclopedia Talmudis.
And we'll get there. We'll get to that later in the podcast.
Okay,
I just wanted to know if you had any
of
them.
I wish. It's my dream. It's my dream to own his library. Even though, in terms of like newness of farm, you could probably. I want to have it. It's just But
So sitting in Baltimore, besides for corresponding with Biegel Eisen and getting all the news farm, and one more thing about that: do we know how he first contacted Biegel Eisen, or that was the farm store? So that's how he somehow got in contact with them, because he never, like you said, they say he never actually went there.
Yeah, he didn't leave Baltimore. So after he came, I think he left Baltimore one time to go to the wedding of an enkel of the Avnei Nezer. So there was an enkel. There was it was during the wartime where I think there wasn't flights available from Israel, and so he went as a covet for for the Zayd, and he left Baltimore to Pittsburgh, I think it was, but he never left Baltimore. He stayed there his whole life.
Got
so
it.
yes, you're asking about Bigel. So
yeah.
So I think it kind of it's a good segue into his correspondence. So he was unknown, again, like I said before, he was unknown to the majority of people, but he was very, very well known to like other gedolim. So he had correspondence with many, and a lot of them are printed in Michoel Ba'achas, in the biography. So there's a lot of them they're by sections, So he had with obviously like all the Eniklich of the Sachachover, that was big, but he had many ones, either from connection from Sachachev, or he would correspond with men of Cutler, who said about him that he said the greatest gun who stepped foot in America, which is a big statement. But he had correspondence with many. So I think he must have, through his connections, through he's saying, I'm looking for Sfarim, and where can I get it? Who deals with this stuff? Who would have these Sfarim? And I guess Bigel was the address at the time. So I think that's probably how he came to be.
Yeah. Now you started mentioning there his correspondence. So sitting in Baltimore, besides for Bigel, did he correspond with Gedolim? Who else was he corresponding with? And do you have some examples of that?
Yeah. So again, like I said, he corresponded with many. And it always like involved like Torah study. And so he said, he would write in his letters like he doesn't want this letter to be like a shtori hedyotis that have no Torah. So he would always like include Torah. And so a lot of the letters like the majority of the letters Torah, and then there's a little bit of other things. So Rav Gifter was a big one. Rav Gifter, and interesting letter where Rav Gifter actually asks him about like Nister. So Forshlager was very big in Nister besides Nigla, and Rav Gifter like pushes. He asks him like there's a back and forth where he asks him specific questions like what about this and what's the derech halimud, and at some point he says I've said enough and the rest is between four eyes Megillah Starim, like you don't so he kind of like he pushed he didn't share it further. There's one very like well known letter which I think is important to mention. He wrote a letter to the Satmar Rebbe, and so very interesting because they hadn't met. I don't really know how he knew of him. I guess he must have known just of that he's a great person. So he writes the letter to the Satmar Rebbe. He says, and he starts with Kadosh b'chol min kedusha. That's his title to the Satmar Rebbe, and he basically asks the following question. So the shul where he used to daven in, they put in a mic for Yom Neram, for like the holy days, like because it's a big crowd back then. High holy days like was very full. So put in a mic, and so obviously you wouldn't go there on those days, and even on Shabbos not, even if they wouldn't use it because Shabbos was only a few dozen people. But he said he wanted to ask if during the week he's allowed to go into that shul to daven, because otherwise he would need to daven at home because he couldn't walk. He was older, and so he's asking, and it's curious why he asked Satmar Rebbe directly, because he probably knew the halacha, and there was other poskim, but I think maybe the Kadosh v'chol min kedushas is maybe where it's a question that it's not necessarily halacha like cut or dry, like okay you're allowed to or not allowed to. He wanted to know like what's the spiritual aspect of it. Should I do it? Should I not? Because these are at stake is davening with a minyan, and on the other hand, like there's this shul that's may or may not be worthy to go in. So Satmar responds back, and he says, and he writes in his title, Alagoin Achasid Hamiti. And I've spoken to many Satmar people, and they said that they've never seen a title like that. He wasn't known to give out titles. It wasn't like he wouldn't exaggerate. And so when he says that, it's Agoin Achasid Hamiti, and those three words have done more for Forshlager's legacy amongst at least Satmar Hasidim and Satmar Talmidim than a lot of what he did himself, because they see, Satmar Rebbe said about him and must be great. So his response is basically, don't go into the shul. And he says, I don't need to tell you because of your Roiv B'Kiyus about Torah, you know everything, you know the whole Torah. So he tells him in brief that he says that there may not be a minyan of Shomer Shabbos people, and it says there's brought down halacha that a person who can't go to shul should have in mind to be mitzdarf le minyan atov b'Yisrael. So to join with the greatest minyan. So he said to do that instead, and I think he did that. He followed and he wouldn't go to that shul. So that was just one of the letters, and there's many. They're in the biography. Like if somebody has connection, Rav Borak, there's different ones. Like there's different. If you have interest in a specific god, like there's different there's sections. So something an interesting. That's a whole like his correspondence is a whole nother. And this actually also a call to the audience is that if anybody knows of letters like in auction, I know there's like I have a lot of sperm collectors. If anybody knows, like just bring it to the attention of the publishers so that we can include it in future editions.
So following up on the same theme, talking about, you mentioned the shul and the microphone and the issue, there was another issue involved in mechitza, and that was another issue with the shul. And in general, this is a problem. There are shuls in Baltimore, shuls all over the country at the time. They were Orthodox shuls, and eventually they gradually drifted left. They drifted towards reform, and unfortunately this happened many times throughout the United States. So what happened here in his shul, and what perhaps you can say over some about the mechitza story?
Yeah, for sure. So yeah, that's a big chapter. So in America at the time, there was three main movements, right? The Reform, which was far left, Orthodox, which kept things as they were, Conservative, which is in the middle. And conservative back then, today it's different. Today it's more established what it is, but back then it was trying to define itself. It was in the middle between the two, and on some things they would, again, early conservative, they were very like they knew the halacha, and they were much more to the right than they are today, and so it was kind of this in the middle, and they would try to define themselves. And there was a lot of shilas at the time about different things, about gittin, about marriage, and about all these different things. So mechitza happened to be one of the big flashpoints where a shul kind of defined itself. If you have a mechitza, then you're more on the Orthodox side. If you don't, then you're more on the conservative, modern side. So Chizuk Emunah, which is where Rabbi Forshlager taught, it was actually originally a breakaway from Baltimore Hebrew congregation, which became Reform. And there was a small subsection of the group who wanted to stay Orthodox, and so they named themselves Chizuk Emunah, strengthening of the faith, and they established themselves as a very frum shul. Now, that was 60 years before this story took place, which is like late 1940s, and so eventually the younger generation started becoming more liberal, and they wanted to have more of like the what the other shuls have, and so they were trying to move towards taking away the mechitza and having family seating, which is a very kind of a big theme at that time. Today, I think there's not as many that switch. It's sort of established, if you have or don't. And so there was a few issues. One is they had to get a 90% vote in order to change something like that. And then the other one was they had to get rabbinical approval. So because it was part of the ritual, part of like the sort of religious aspect of the shul, it wasn't just a random like kind of, do we have a kiddush or not kind of a thing. So they need to get some rabbinical approval. So they wrote a letter to JTS, Jewish Theological Seminary, to Louis Ginsburg, who was a professor of Talmud, basically asking this question, can we take away the mechitza? What are the biblical, sources for this? So their response, Ginsburg's response was that even though it's not explicit in Torah, and he said that the reasons for it have changed. So originally it was to separate from the idol worshippers, and it's not so relevant today. He says that it's a hallowed tradition. It's a sacred custom amongst Jewish people. We see archaeological evidence of mechitzas, the separation of men and women, and it shouldn't be changed. And he said, and he wrote, he's like, I know this won't satisfy either side because he's not really answering the question either or. So they weren't happy with this, and they basically wrote back again saying that we have a lot of people threatening to leave. That if they don't change, then they'll just leave and they'll move to a reform shul, and they'll basically lose all these people. And so the response to that was that the spiritual needs of the majority should be more important than the spiritual needs of the minority. So if the majority needs that for their spirituality, for sitting with families, then that's what they should do. So Rabbi Forshlager was there at the time, and he was trying to work to kind of push the tide back, to stay with the mechitza. So this was his custom. Whenever shilas would come to him, he would write a very long treatment of the thing in his writings, in his notebooks, and then he would write a shortened version to the relevant party. And so he wrote a very long, maybe 140 pages in his manuscripts about mechitza and about kedusha and about this is B'Sek Knesset and about Avodas Hashem and all these different topics. And then he sent a small section of that with the sources, with exact, his reasoning and the sources to Louis Ginsburg, translated in English. So we had the record of that. Not the record, but Yisrael Tabak was a rabbi in Baltimore, and he was close to Rabbi Forshlager, and he helped with the translation. So he wrote, I translated a letter. The letter so far has not even found or any response from Ginsburg in the Ginsburg archives, but hopefully that turns up at some point. In any case, they went to a vote, and the vote came in favor of removing the mechitza. So that same day, he basically cut ties with the shul. He was giving share there. He would give share there, for I think that was the first shul, decades. He cut ties, and he writes this letter to them with the utmost respect, and the letter, there have been, in America and in Europe also very polemical style letters around different topics, and you have letters that are yelling, and this was a very he writes with my first dollar in America that I earned was in the shul, and I know I have so much love and connection with all of you, but my stance in Judaism, and I have no choice but to basically cut my ties. And actually, in a book that Chizuk Emunah gave out, they say that Rabbi Forshlager left, and it was something that they were sad about. It was a consequence of this vote, but they were actually upset, or they weren't so happy that he had to leave, because clearly he had an impact. So the letter, that's the sefer that's being published, is this Kedushas Michoel, is basically that letter, the long version, where he goes through a lot of detail. So yeah, he established himself as someone who knew exactly what the right path is, and he was willing to give up a lot. He was willing to give up his maybe his main source of income and for his values.
So we'll talk more about this farm later, but once we mentioned the story, we may as well at least finish discussing this brand new sefer, Kedushas Michoel, right here, which is, does it include a historical background, as an introduction? I haven't seen it yet. So does it include that besides for just the whole, what does it include in the sefer?
Yeah, absolutely. Great question. So I got a sort of a little bit of a preview from the publisher, just because I had this interview and I wanted to be able to talk about it to your listeners, because I think it's something very special, and it should come out in by the yard site. That's the plan. It's going to be shipped in from Israel. So usually they send it by boat, but they're going to just so Mirz Hashem, it should be out. So yeah, there's a very detailed introduction, I think 12 pages of basically the historical background in general about the different movements, and then about the mechitza issue, kind of where that fell into the general thing, and it also has a little mini biography of Rabbi Forshlager for those who haven't read the Michoel, so you kind of get a sense of who he was. So it's an excellent introduction, and I hope that it'll get translated to English, because I think that it can appeal to a wide audience. So the sefer itself, they did a wonderful job. So we'll talk about the other Sfarim, but the Torah is not his original language. They basically took from his manuscripts, he didn't write specifically on Torah, but they took different sections, and they kind of adjusted the language to be more approachable. This one, they kept his language, his lashon, and they broke it up very beautifully into sections about topics, and within each section, different, so I haven't had a chance to go over it completely. I think it'll take time to really understand the depth and the scope, but it's something that's very, again, it's really about Avodas Hashem. It's about his brand, and in general, this is a side note. I've always found that not his lumdus as much, but the Torah, it's almost like a sort of a biography. He kind of talks about he talks about these madregas and Avodas Hashem, his levels, and really everything he talked about, he lived. He wasn't talking in the abstract. He was talking in the lived experience. And so, and you see, and I've published a newsletter in the past, where there's parallels, when he talks about, eating and how he actually ate, when he talks about learning and how he actually learned. So I've seen it as a biography, and this is a way to get inside him, understand who he was, because he didn't write much about himself other than the letters, which is not really about himself. It's about, the topic or about the other person. So yeah.
So I want to talk more about his manuscripts and his farm and the new editions. Exactly, you already mentioned some of that, but we'll focus on that specifically in a bit. But I want to get back to him, just the end of his life. So what happened towards the end of his life and his burial. You mentioned already that he's buried in Baltimore, but you can talk more about it at the cover, and then we can talk more about the the rediscovery, if you will, of Michoel Forshlager. But let's first start off with the end of his life until the end of his life, till his death.
Yeah. So I mean, towards the end of his life, he suffered a lot. He had like a lot of problems, like with his health. And he would, but he said he would be in the hospital, for a month. We couldn't learn that he had issues with his eyes. So, and he said, like, while I was in the hospital, I was machadish, like the equivalent of a full sefer. Like he would, so he's still constantly thinking about all of that. And he passed away, Tazov Chesron Tavshin Yotes, and it was just 65 years ago. He's buried in Baltimore. And there was a big funeral. A lot of people came. There's actually Mr. Carfunkel is well-known person, and he was actually there as a child at the funeral. He was there as a kid, and they came to the schools, and so he's a lot of the Sfarim are Majoris Carfunkel, which is a big schus. He's very, very involved in like the publishing efforts. So he's buried in Baltimore, and again, basically from his burial until 50 years ago, pretty unknown. Like, he didn't publish anything in his lifetime. He shied away from all positions of greatness. So he refused to be a Rav, Rosh Hashiva. Even they offered him. Rabbi Shapiro actually offered him the position of be Rosh Hashiva of Chachmei Lublin. When he was in America, Rabbi Shapiro came to America, and he actually came to call him back, and he refused. And he actually regretted that. He regretted that decision, but I guess for the best, because he would have, he probably would have passed. But he recommended his friend, the Kashkavar Gun, to be the Rosh Hashiva, and he actually was Rosh Hashiva after Rabbi Shapiro was nifter. Also interesting that Rabbi Shapiro's death is also coming up very soon. And so he passed away, and it was quiet for a long time. Talk about, if you want to talk about now, like the sale of his farm. And then kind of maybe early publishing, but yeah, it's basically.
Yeah, I do want to talk about that. So during his lifetime, he never published anything, right? He didn't publish, but he had all this farm, he had all his manuscripts. What was the life of his library? So, and both parts, all the farm that he bought, we mentioned already, he's buying farm from Piegeleisen, and in manuscripts, his many writings. What happened with that?
Yeah, so let's talk about the publishing thing for a second. So he refused part of the same thing of like not wanting to be public, not wanting to be, he had he said he had his reasons for not wanting to publish, and he fought back. Like he Pardis published something about him, and he wrote them like he wanted to take it down, and Rav Meiser's argued back, and in any case, so there's some published but he refused. And actually his sister asked him why he does, what is he writing for if he's not publishing? He said, if my Torah is worthy to be published, Hashem will send his messengers, which we've seen. And we say, even Sefer Torah Shabbat needs mazel, and there's kind of this life of its own of when things came out, for what generation. And clearly, our generation is when it's needed, and it's coming out now. So even after his life, he's still working up there to kind of pull the strings of when things happen. So he had a huge library, and his about 50 large manuscripts, which he would do. Actually, he would finish a manuscript each year for Erev Pesach as a siyum for Yuzah B'chor, and so he would publish it. And he said, my cousin said that he had this beautiful gold pen that he would and he would buy expensive paper. He clearly was doing it for the future, and even today, his manuscripts they look new, they look fresh, they look new, very good condition. He clearly knew he had a sort of a eye for the future. So his library was designed by different groups, different organizations. He ended up going to Yad Rav Herzog in Israel. They published the Encyclopedia Talmudis. They were a very well-known, machon. And so they purchased it with the condition that they would publish some of his writings. That was part of the condition. So they were given the manuscripts to hold on to as kind of as guardians, because they were working on it. It wasn't the manuscripts weren't sold to them, just the Sfarim were. And they set someone up. They set someone on it. So Rabbi Kreizel, he was the Rosh Yeshiva Square. He was a well-known Talmid Chacham from Yerushalayim. So he worked on it, and actually, before there was scanning and he did it by eye, he did it by hand, and he actually suffered with his eyes from that, from kind of all the effort of reading the small. It's a hard script as well. And so they published one sefer they called it Torah Michoel, which is on sugis. They wanted to cover shas, so they sugis and shas. So it starts from, there's a beautiful sugi on brachas, eating without a bracha, and you're like geneva, which I don't have this time to talk about the specific, but yeah, and it covers kind of all, mostly not psak, although there's a couple that where there's a question if you're allowed to remove a cornea of an eye, like from a dead body as a transplant, because you're not allowed to have enough from a dead person. And so he uses as a proof the story of Elisha and Gehazi, where like he brought him back to life, but how could he have touched him when he was a client? So very interesting how he kind of his derech, but mostly not psak. So he wrote this long tshuva, this sefer that came out. Now they only published that one sefer, and for a long time that was it. So I think that was about a few years after his passing, and for a long time there was nothing. About 15 years ago, there was a man in I mentioned him before, Rabbi Bergman. He was from Polish Hasidus as well, and he found this sefer, this Torah Michoel. He found this sefer in a library in his yeshiva. He found it, and he sees like Rabbi Forshlager in America. And what's interesting actually is that the head of the Machon was Rav Zevin. Rav Zevin was the head of the Machon, and Zevin is known. He wrote the Ishim V'Shittas, and he wrote a mini Ishim V'Shittas on Rav Forshlager in the Sefer as an introduction, talking about who he was and his derech halimud, and actually like the name Michoel Ba'achas comes from there, where he wrote that it says the Malachim each fly in a different amounts of flights. So Michoel flies in once, or Michoel Ba'achas. And you see when you see Rav Forshlager's scope of Torah, it's Michoel Ba'achas. He sees the whole Torah in front of him all at once, and there's no limits, right? There's no, there's not, this is, I don't learn this, or this is, and he connected all of it. So Rabbi Bergman started looking into who he was, asking people questions, and eventually became the expert, because there's no one else. So he became, the one who talked to big lies, and he talked to family members, and he interviewed people in Baltimore, and so out of that came this Michoel Ba'achas, the Sefer. So he published that first one, he found the letters, and it was recently, it was out of print for a long time, and people really wanted to get it, and it was republished with all the additional material that has come out since it became more public. So that's a beautiful thing to read. It's been translated into English. And so he got involved in a little bit in the manuscripts. Now, the manuscripts were at some point given over to a family member. So there's a great nephew of Rav Forshlager named Rav Friedman. He lived in Israel. He lives in Israel, and he would go visit the library with family members, with other people. You should know, like this. Again, when there was no one, he tried, and actually he worked in a library, like an academic library, and so he would every day bring one of the manuscripts and scan the pages. And over a bunch of years, he'd scanned all of the pages. So now they're all digital. So that's a big. So you don't have to actually use the actual manuscript. He pushed forward that, in a big way. And then Rav Bergman came along, and Rav Bergman started working on the manuscript. So the next one he did was Al Torah, which I think is very appropriate because it's something that's easy. It's on the parsha, beautiful divrei Torah, and it's a mix of like that same like broad scope of learning. It's his he has Nister in there a little bit, and he has like Hasidus. It's a very beautiful blend of things, and again, each thing has like a very strong message of like, what are we supposed to do? How are we supposed to live? How are we supposed to approach Torah? And I learned it, and it's beautiful. And so he also republished the original Michoel Ba'achas, the Torah Michoel, the Sugis of Shas, with a beautiful mafteach, because again, a lot of the authors are very unknown. Like a lot of the Sfarim that he quotes are unknown, so he talks a little bit about who they were. And so you can kind of like work that way. And then the next one he did was this letter about the Mechitza, which is a beautiful, and again, I'm excited to actually have the copy. I don't have it yet, but I'm looking forward to kind of, again, each time you get a bigger sense of who he was, and really we have what's out there is a tiny percentage of what's there.
So as you mentioned, the Mechitza one, and I guess I could assume the one on Shas also is kind of as he wrote it, put out there. They transcribed and put out his writings, but the Torah one is kind of collected, and they changed the language as well. It's not his actual. It's not actually what he wrote. It was actually tweaked a little.
Yeah. So Rabbi Bergman explained to me that there was a lot of effort put into that because he didn't write, he didn't write it like a sefer. He didn't write even on Torah. He wrote on different parshas, but they also pulled from different, had to divide things up, and it's important to understand that he didn't really write in a style of publishing, right? He wasn't writing a sefer. He didn't edit his writings. He just wrote it as it came, and kind of so to really to learn his stuff is challenging. You need some kind of support, and so even some of keeping cheshbon of the alatar, you're like, hey, he has this and he has this other idea, and he builds and he brings, and so it's in order to make it accessible to a wide audience, that's what he did. He made it kind of he expanded the language, right? So he said he expanded the language, and he has the original words, but they're also filled out. So sometimes he'll say a concept in 2 words, and he kind of expands what he meant, understanding. So yeah, and again, you see even with the new sefer that you have to really al kashmi, you have to keep track of what he's saying, and he kind of goes from thing to thing. So even that one, the Kedushas Michoel is divided up. So there's notes at the bottom of what he meant, or so it's processed in a way. It's just not, he kept the lashon. So yeah, I think there's kind of benefits to both sides, and yeah, it was a decision he made that should be more widely available for the Hamoy Am, and I think for that one it was the good choice because it really is easily accessible. Anyone can open it up. You don't need to understand his derech, and you can kind of take something out of it.
What is his derech? And I've kind of mentioned it here or there, but what is his derech halimud? What can someone expect from the Sfarim? And well, okay. Let's go back. What was his derech halimud, and do you see his derech halimud in the Sfarim? Not necessarily, as you were saying.
So I don't know if I can say if I see his derech halimud because I'm still I haven't learned his full thing. But so in Sachachav, this is the Igli Tal Akdama, he talks about how that there was the derech of pilpul, and that wasn't their derech. There wasn't pilpul. It was really understanding the sugya al deeply with the Rishonim, right? So they went back to the Rishonim, understanding each one, how they learned the sugya, how they la'uram nelich, right? Like he says, the Rishonim there, we can't touch them. We have to understand what they meant, and if there's a difficulty, we have to understand why we think it's difficult. That was really the derech of Sachacham, was understanding the sugya very, very deeply with the Rishonim, and that's how they took psak. They took psak by going there and understanding what each Rishon did. And so he writes in his manuscripts that the same thing, right? The Rishonim, but he writes that when he works on a sugya on a topic, he doesn't leave it until every letter is miyushav. Every letter fits. Everything is for Emperor. There's no questions remain, and not just in the sugya itself, but across Shas. And that's maybe something unique about him. His personality is that he was both, the Oikar Harm and the Sinai, because he had both. He had huge, very, very broad scope, but it was very, very deep. And sometimes it's either or. Sometimes you have someone who's very broad but doesn't delve in deep, and sometimes you have, someone's deep in the sugya, but then they don't, fit what they're saying to everywhere else. And he really fits it everywhere else. I think that the brachas one is a good example, just to kind of illustrate this, where so Rashi says that when someone eats without a bracha, they're stealing. So they're stealing. That's what the Gemara says. They're stealing. So Rashi says they're stealing the brachas. So Rabbi Forshlager asks, why not say that you're stealing the actual food, right? That's the classic, you tell kids, you're stealing the food. So he explains with kinyanik zela. So he says, food, when are you a mechuyev with a bracha? When you have to make a bracha? When you enjoy it. So there's a machlokes regarding me'ila, when the enjoyment comes. It's either in the back of your throat or in your stomach when you digest it. He says either way, it's certainly not when it goes into your mouth or when you chew it or when you taste it. But he says that kinyanik zela say that when a guy who chews something, he's koine it through the chewing because it changes shini ma'is, it changes it. And so he says if you would say that he steals the actual food, he couldn't, because he was already koine it with kinyanik zela before he was mechuyev with the bracha. Just as a small example, where he kind of uses a very different sugya, where a very different sugya to kind of explain this idea. And so that's his derech in general, like overall, seeing the whole thing and really trying to explain it. Now, in his writings, we see that. So we see he says like sometimes Indian where he and some of his topics go on for hundreds of pages in the manuscripts, where he's dealing with one topic, but like whatever there is to say about it. So he goes through all of Shas and Paiskim and Kabbalah, like all of it. And so I think really understand his limit. I think we're very far from that. I think we have only a little bit. So I'll try to see where he kind of goes into detail, but it's hard to see because it's not always how some of the pieces are not exactly how we intended, and also they're shorter pieces. They're not like a full sugya. I think maybe the Mechitza one maybe will be a little bit more. I think the Shas one certainly is a good approach. I just, again, like I said, I think we need to establish a koil that they study his, especially as more Sfarim come out, understand, because I don't think that the full story of his things will end when the Sfarim are published. I think that's the beginning. The same way we have like with the great Gedolim, like people spend their lives trying to understand what's the sheet of this gadol, or what's Rabbi Ber's derech halimud. And think the reason why it was called Torah Michoel was because they say it was a new Torah, it was a unique Torah just for him. And so I think that understanding fully his legacy, I think will take a lot more years and more people studying it and having it brought more into the mainstream. And I think there's a lot there. So yeah.
So what's the plan for the rest of the manuscripts? How many manuscripts are there?
So there's 50 very large manuscripts, and each one pages are very big. So when you say like, one page is probably at least two pages, of normal. Plus, if you add in, marmakaimis, and if you expand it, then it's even more. So Rav Bergman is the one who's dealing with he's the one who's Shem sent him, and he's the right person certainly to kind of work on this. So he hasn't just, he's kind of, there's a question which one to focus on next. There is an idea, and a plan that's sort of, which also depends on a lot of financial resources, is to basically just focus on typing all of the manuscripts up and having them available. So either on Otzar Chachma or some other site, just having them available for anybody to access. And then kind of A, you have it there so people can start learning it already. And then B, like you can pick and choose. And there's so that's the future. And again, a lot of it depends on having the money to be able to do this, because it's a big effort. It's it takes a long time. It takes you have to get someone who's precise, because otherwise you're doing the work twice. Once you type it up and it's imprecise, you have to go fix it. So you're finding the right people who are very precise in their understand, and maybe even understand his derech a little bit, so they can make decisions. Oh, what did he mean here? What letter is this? Because again, like I said, he suffered with his eyes, so his writing is very difficult for me at least, to decipher. Yeah, that's the future. Hopefully to have them all published and have them be on the shelves of Klal Yisrael.
Okay, so I will link in the show's notes to the biography, to Michoel Bachas, to Torah Michoel, to the Torah Michoel on Shas. If
the website.
To the website, of course, to the website. But I'll put also the links to this farm that people can purchase, as well as the new one if I have a link.
Right.
And
Not
just
sure
finally to end off, there is a website. Yeah, you can mention that here, the website. But also to end off, is there any way, if anyone wants to get involved, or anyone just in any way, how can they do so?
Yeah, so a few things. So first, the website it's an ongoing effort. So it's not, but it's something. It's something. It has some information. As the farm has links over there, has information about the caver, which again has been hard to find in the past. Now it's which also, as a side note, caver is a big in Baltimore. People come to visit it, and people are seeing Yeshuas over there. So RabbiForshlager.com. That's the website. If you want to connect directly to the person, the publisher, so there's an email, Machon RF, so Machon Rabbi Forshlager, Machon RF. So if people want to connect directly, support, donate towards that. That's a way.
At Gmail.
I think
what's the email?
At gmail.com. Yeah. Machon RF. So MACHON RF. That's the
I'll
for the
put it in the
publisher.
show's notes. Yeah, and I'll put it in the show's notes.
Yeah. And then the website also should have I think a contact button or something. And then in terms of his legacy, so there's a few things. I think one for me, I think what he would want is to study his Torah. Really, his whole life was exclusively Torah. That was it. And the message is people to get more involved in Torah, not just his. Obviously, it's great to learn this stuff. I think it's really nice, but just in general, learn Torah. People do it in Nishmasei, Rabbi Forshlager, ben Avnei Nezer. It's will be certainly good for his neshama when people are more involved. And I think in general, just knowing who he was and being able to share that here in America, there was a gadol who dedicated himself to Torah and established this concept that Torah of that caliber is possible here. It's not just in Europe. It's not just in Israel. It's possible in America to achieve. And again, that idea that he sort of pioneered is now sort of widely. Obviously, America is one of the biggest requirements of Torah in the world. People don't doubt that America is a place for learning. There's many great yeshivas and koilim and talmid chachamim and even Baltimore who are very serious about their learning. But in his time, it was a radical idea. Wasn't a sort of a given. And so I think that, and then his yahrzeit is coming up. So if you want to visit his cave in Baltimore, it's in the Bnei Israel Cemetery. Again, on the website, there's exact information of how to get there. And I think that's mostly, yeah. I mean, as we continue, hopefully there'll be more specific opportunities for people if they want to get involved. But for now, I think it's just learning, visiting his caver, and then if they want to get involved with either this farm or the general legacy.
Okay. Thank you very much, Pinny, for joining me. So again, anyone can check out the website for more information. There's also, you can check out there was an article in Ami a couple of years ago, so you can check out that. That's like a very short version of the bio if you want to check out. Also, there's, we said, the biography in Hebrew, the biography in English. You can sample some of the Torah. So there's really a lot for anyone interested that wants to learn more about Rabbi Forshlager. And hopefully this podcast, for those that weren't familiar, and even for those that were familiar, a little bit more, but for those that are familiar, you're able to learn a little bit about Rabbi Forshlager. And thank you, Pinny, for joining me.
Thank you very much, Naki, for having me and for allowing the space to talk about Rabbi Forshlager.